Evening, everyone in the East Coast of the United States. If you're watching from Japan, good morning. On behalf of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, Promoting Good Governance in the Global Commons, the United States, Japan, and Beyond. My name is Tobias Harris, and I'm the Deputy Director of the GMF Asia Program. The Global Commons, domains beyond the sovereign jurisdiction of any single state, but to which all states have access, are essential to the stability and prosperity of the international order. These domains provide essential public goods, such as trade routes, transportation and communication networks, fish stocks, satellite imagery, global positioning, and e-commerce infrastructure that benefit countries around the world. In recent years, the governance regimes of the Global Commons have faced intensifying challenges due to the shift in the international political, economic, and security environments. As a result, these domains have become increasingly crowded and contested. Thanks to the support of the United States-Japan Foundation, the GMF Asia program will soon be publishing an edited collection looking at these emerging challenges across the maritime, outer space, and cyberspace domains, and the opportunities for the US and Japan to cooperate to promote effective rules and norms to address them. The United States and Japan have been drawn closer together by these issues, by their common interest in maintaining a rules-based international system, as well as by their shared values. Both countries stand to benefit from strengthening the governance of the Global Commons in ways that will continue to support their own security and prosperity. Both countries also recognize that there is a need for reform for existing regimes, and in some cases, construction of new ones. Today, we are joined by 4 of the authors featured in GMF's forthcoming publication. We are joined by Kristi Govella, who is the editor of the volume and the author of a paper covering overarching developments across the maritime, outer space, and cyber domains. She is an assistant professor of Asian studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and my predecessor as deputy director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund. John Bradford is a senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technical University in Singapore. In his paper, he focuses on the opportunities for the US and Japanese Coast Guards to play a leadership role in maritime governance. Saadia Pekkanen is the Job and Gertrud Tamaki Endowed Professor in the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. Her paper focuses on the evolving state practice for the exploitation of resources in outer space. Finally, Motohiro Tsuchiya is a professor in the Graduate School of Media and Governance at Keio University. In our edited collection, he focuses on the cyberspace domain and the dangers of cognitive warfare. I'd like them all to please unmute their microphones and turn their cameras on. And before we begin our discussion, just a little housekeeping note that we will hopefully go to questions from the audience fairly soon. And if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A function, and I will try to get to as many of those as I can over the course of the hour. And so with that, we're going to start our discussion now. Kristi, I would like to start with a question for you. What are some of the overarching findings that emerge from this project?
So this is a fascinating project because it really brings together 3 very different domains that have a lot of common challenges, but also some distinct differences. So in my contribution to the edited volume, as you said, I look at issues broadly across all 3 domains. And I think that piece really highlights that many of the core issues are really around issues of openness versus enclosure and how these spaces and their resources are used, which really goes to a question of what stakeholders want these domains to look like in the future and how they want themselves and others to be able to behave within them. So as you mentioned in your introduction, we really see challenges to existing principles, rules, norms, and decision-making procedures that are caused by things like changes in technology, geopolitical power shifts, and increasing participation by new actors. And we see this across all the domains. And those changes have really exacerbated the already existing tensions in these debates about openness and enclosure. So, I think one interesting finding that is definitely true is that there is an increasing need to engage multiple stakeholders in the formation of governance, as well as to make sure that the governance covers new types of behavior and activities. And this is playing out in different ways, but it's certainly a movement that you see across all 3. Also in my paper, it's interesting that we see, in addition to these traditional questions, also new ones about sustainability, participation, rights, et cetera, emerging as more important, again, with the entrance of new stakeholders. So for example, to focus on sustainability as one aspect, I talk about very different things like fisheries management and green shipping practices in the maritime domain versus debris and that problem in outer space. And also in cyberspace, the problem of carbon emissions related to data centers and cryptocurrency mining. But across all of these domains, you see basically negative externalities or different kinds of incentives leading to practices that really have consequences for the environment, and more people concerned about how to deal with this. So obviously there's also a lot of difference across the domains. The regimes that govern them are in a fundamentally different state, with maritime really being developed over centuries with relatively strong principles and structured rules in place. So, when we think about cyberspace, it is not ungoverned, but it is certainly in a much newer state, and outer space being in between. So a lot of what we've looked at in the findings of the volume is how the US and Japan can work together. But of course, that looks different across these domains depending on what state they're in. So in maritime, for example, we talk a lot more about not establishing new rules necessarily, but building consensus around interpretations of those rules and norms that need to be strengthened, because even if the principles and rules that are in place are sound ones, they don't necessarily affect behavior unless there is strong legitimacy and buy-in. Whereas in the case of outer space, some of those issues are evolving as states have the capacity to do new things. This is non-state actors are more involved. And of course, in cyberspace, some key principles are still up for debate. So it's interesting to look at how the US and Japan can work together across these cases. In some cases, just through consulting with one another. In other cases, by coordinating their efforts in different venues. And then in some cases, by directly cooperating and trying to build coalitions with like-minded state and non-state actors to really affect global governance as such. So I think overall, the volume really tries to emphasize that we not only need to look at tactical responses to these changes, but to keep in mind overarching governance issues and establishing principles, norms, rules, and decision-making behaviors that really create the basis for stable behavior and can support security and prosperity. So those are a few things that I can share from the overarching findings.
Great, thank you for setting us up with that framing. I'd like to turn to John Bradford now. And John, what do you see as the biggest challenges in maritime governance, and why do you think that the US and Japanese Coast Guards could be part of the solution to these challenges?
Yeah, thanks, Tobias. It's great to be asked that question, and I just want to thank Kristi for not only bringing us together and herding us cats, but also taking away most of the answer to the question, so I get an easy job today. I wanted to first kind of start by just saying what I see governance as in the maritime domain, and I think that's just important to framing the rest of my answer. So governance is it's the deliberate establishment of rules, and then it's ensuring that all the stakeholders follow those rules. And those stakeholders are states, but they're also the shippers and the insurers and the navies and the fishers and the transportation operators and all the different users of the maritime domain. And the maritime domain is one of the biggest economic sectors in the world in many, many areas. It would even be the leading sector. And so therefore, making sure we have good governance is essential. Now, as Kristi said, we have rules in the maritime domain. They've been evolving ever since international commerce really took off in the 16th century. And in the 20th century, they really got pulled together under UNCLOS and other conventions into something that's, a compromise, but quite comprehensive. And by compromise, I mean different states have different interpretations, but overall, most rules are agreed on, and the places where the interpretations are different, we understand where those interpretations are different, and it goes back to the international conventions and where they were actually negotiated, and the tensions that come with compromise where everybody thinks this is a good enough deal, but maybe not the best deal. So now what we're seeing an acceleration of challenges to that governance in that there are actors that don't want to follow the rules or attempting to edge around the rules for their own gains. Now, we usually hear about this in terms of states, and we hear states which are seeking to change the rules and maybe going outside of the legal process or the diplomatic process to do that. But also increasingly, states are using what are called gray zone tactics, where they work in the space that's the governance holes, the governance weakness spots, and seek to take advantage of other states without going to open war. And I also think that, as we can see, current day conflicts in Europe and Africa, unfortunately, war is not something that's in history either. But I think the states question, this is primarily maybe I have a very realpolitik view of it, but this is primarily a matter of for diplomacy and hard security and management and diplomacy. There's a lot which can be done to deal with the other maritime threats to good governance, which are increasingly becoming problematic. These include non-state actors, so terrorists, pirates, smugglers, human traffickers, IUU fishers. So there's illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishers. Slavery continues to be a big problem at sea because where governance is weak. And then increasingly environmental threats. And this is both changes in the domain that are being caused by people ashore and just simply people at sea or around the sea abusing the environment. So unfortunately, all of those problems are going to become more acute, I believe, because I think interstate competition is only going to get more acute. I think climate change is only going to get more acute. I think people are only going to become more reliant on the sea. So you have more people reliant on the sea, more competition over the resources, more destruction of the resources, and more folks seeking to use that environment for their own illegal gains. So the US and Japan, I think, should be the leaders to stepping up and addressing these problems. They're the two of the three greatest maritime states. I would argue they are the two most important maritime states. So they can set norms and they can set rules through their leadership. But they can also come together and pool their diplomatic and economic resources and set enforcement standards. The really important area here is capacity building. The international system puts maritime governance on the back of the states, for better or for worse. That's the system that we have. But many, many states lack the capacity to provide good governance in the waters around them. And that's where we see the worst problems. That's where we see the worst problems is in states that don't have the resources to perform good governance beyond their shore. Many of those states are the same states which are having difficulty providing governance ashore. So there's a spectrum there. But US and Japan, as I kind of mentioned before, we are the world leading maritime powers. We're the two of the three largest economies with trade heavily reliant on the sea. They're the two most powerful global navies. They're the two most globally powerful coast guards. Japan vies with Korea and China as the world's biggest ship owner. If you take the volumes of their fleets by the value of the ships, they're number 2 and number 4 in the world. The maritime insurance agencies are basically concentrated in 3 cities. 2 of those are Tokyo and New York. They continue to be the biggest investors in maritime infrastructure and maritime capacity around the world. We hear a lot about China's projects, the BRI and the Maritime Silk Road. But actually, if you total up private and government investment, both Japan and the United States far exceed what China is doing globally. I could go on that list. Technology is also a place that they lead. So if you have these 2 states that are generally very like-minded and both generally strong supporters of the rules and they have those resources, they should come together. And quickly, I'll just kind of finalize that question with what some of those specific things are. I think the first thing that the US and Japan should do is just set up a system where they talk about maritime issues. I mean, they do that currently in the 2+2, and they do that currently in various different interagency dialogues, but I think there should be a multi-agency maritime space with US and Japan talk and coordinate their policies. They should focus on helping others provide governance. Capacity building is important. They're doing this, but they could do it smarter and more efficiently. And frankly, I'm in favor of doing it more. But if extra resourcing isn't possible, extra coordination can make us more efficient with the resources we're already investing in that area. Diplomatically, they could coordinate. They can coordinate at the International Maritime Order and elsewhere. Japan's done a great job of setting up regional and global organizations for maritime space, such as the Northwest Pacific Coast Guard Forum and the head of Asian Coast Guards agencies, and now the Global Coast Guard Summit. So Japan's done all of that on its own. The US, I think, could be a more active supporter and could even become a co-leader in some of those areas. And then, it's not just the US and Japan alone. There's a lot of key agencies, other key countries that could work together on a case-by-case basis, depending on the issue and depending on the space, which other global partner to work with makes more sense in some states than others. But it's not a matter of these two countries doing it on their own. It's these two countries, I believe, providing leadership to the world. Thanks.
Thanks for that, John. Before we move along, I just want to remind people, if you've any questions from what you've heard so far, feel free to start putting them in the Q&A box. And when we move along, I will draw from those questions. But in the meantime, I want to move along to Saadia Pekkanen. Saadia, in your paper on outer space, you write about the controversial issue of extracting resources from space. Where do you think that space governance is headed on this issue in particular?
So first of all, thank you so much to the German Marshall Fund and Kristi for starting this conversation about the commons, and Tobias for helping us take it forward. The governance, so I'm going to echo some of the themes that both Kristi and John have already sort of put on the table, which will make for a more fruitful conversation at the end. So let me begin by talking just a tiny bit about the governance of space resources and what that means. That means you're getting water and resources, minerals, and that I think from celestial bodies like asteroids and the moon. And to be perfectly honest, that is a work in progress. So what we know now is that states will play an extremely important role in sort of establishing the law and policy frameworks for how it all evolves forward. That, of course, is wonderful because for once, law and policy is not simply playing catch up to the technology, but really has an opportunity to sort of help shape some of the realities that do play out in a peaceful and sustainable manner. Now, presently, I think that there are controversies about whether space resources can be owned and exploited for commercial purposes by private parties. I think of these as non-state actors based on some aspects of international space law. And I think that these are all very important debates, and I think that they will continue onwards. But what I believe is that we need to look beyond controversy to actually assess what states are already doing in terms of the governance of space resources. And here, I want to draw a little bit of attention to what spacefaring powers like the United States and Japan are already doing, and how that can potentially affect the way that this regime evolves. And we can see that this is happening through national legislation by both the United States and also Japan. So led by the United States, I think we're really beginning to see state practice moving forward. And in 2015, the US set up the first law in the world that recognized the rights of private persons to possess, own, transport, use, and sell space resources. Like the United States, Japan too began to then develop the legal basis for recognizing the rights of private persons to own space resources, and has enacted its own Space Resources Act in 2021. Now, dominant space powers like the US and Japan are not the only ones that are doing this. Luxembourg has done the same thing. The United Arab Emirates has also done the same thing. So we're beginning to see an expanding zone of countries that are following the same interpretive pathways, particularly through their national legislation that is tethered to the principles of the Outer Space Treaty. Let me say something a little bit more about Japan, because the matter has really moved beyond controversy to actually how states are putting this into practical effect. Just on 4th November, 2022, just a week or so ago, Japan issued, the Prime Minister issued the first license to collect regolith by its first lander to a company called iSpace. And this regolith will be sold to NASA, and it symbolically is about transferring ownership of a space resource. And we will, of course, wait to see what happens practically and in space when this does take place. But what these building blocks suggest is that states are putting in place, and Japan is leading in this, a basis for a commercial space economy. This is already sort of in the works. So one reason for optimism is to think about the fact that moving beyond controversy, states are really thinking of pragmatic ways to try to build this commercial space economy. And I think Japan, as well as the United States, have really kind of showing the way forward. Now, this commonality of approach in both the United States and Japan, as John was also saying in the maritime domain, I think really bodes well for allied work in the space domain, particularly in the civilian and commercial exploitation of space resources. And as you know, Japan has already signed the Artemis Accords in October 2020, and the number of countries that is signing up to that is expanding, and that also builds a very important base for thinking about expanding this kind of governance of space resources. So just to sort of conclude, I think that these kind of small building steps, I think Kristi was absolutely correct. You know, when you look at the maritime domain governance, it took hundreds of years. We're really at the early stages of seeing how this is going to evolve out practically. But I think Japan and the United States are really showing the way. I think that they can work together to think more carefully about how you build responsible development of space resources moving forward. They're very much positioned to lead with bigger and more inclusive coalitions of states who are also inspired and also interested in sort of space resources and what those space resources can do for their own country's development and benefit. So there are important opportunities there going forward. And we can talk a little bit more about the venues or mechanisms through which the countries can do that in the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Finally, for Motohiro, in your paper, you write about cognitive warfare as a challenge in the cyber domain. And I really, having read the paper, really love that concept. If you could explain to our audience what is cognitive warfare, and how should countries like the United States and Japan be thinking about updating cyber governance to deal with it?
Thank you, Tobias. Thank you, Kristi and others, so inviting me to this webinar. So I'm connecting from a hotel in a local city. So I have found my connection is not so good. So if it is disrupted, it might be a cyber attack by foreign actors. I apologize for that. Of states' conception of operational domains is happening now. So land, sea, and air are operational. But cyberspace, but outer space is a fourth, and cyberspace is a fifth operational domain. But 4 years ago, Japan's 2018 National Defense Program guidelines added electromagnetic space as a sixth. To revise the guidelines. So many self-defense force people talking about cognitive warfare. I don't know, it might be recognized as a seventh operational domain, but so it is this domain includes perception and reasoning. It is by exploitation of information to you're thinking about. So it is a disruption of or interference of what we believe or what we think's true. So mind control is a religious bio-religious problem now in Japan, because they did by how these kinds of people are manipulated by a religious group, that is a big problem now. Not only religious groups, but also other Chinese people believe that Taiwan is part of China, but it is not true outside China. So such different truths might clash and might cause a war. It is quite difficult to change people's minds if they believe something from the bottom of their hearts. So strategic or rational thinking might not work in some cases. And we see propaganda in the but digital technologies are changing the landscape so very quickly. So it is changing. And so they are very subtle and they seem natural. People misunderstand that they find the truth by themselves, but they might be manipulated by someone else. So today, many of information coming through smartphones or PCs or tablets and other digital devices. So much of digital information are not screened or edited or checked by good editors of newspapers, journals, or TV stations. So these information might change our way of thinking. That's a problem these days. And we don't have a good governance system. IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force, W3C, World Wide Web Consortium, Internet Society, those kind of organizations are available for internet governance, but they are not regulating content at all. So Twitter, Facebook, other social media, can they effectively regulate the content? Maybe no. So this is a problem we are facing these days. I hope Japanese government, US government, other governments can regulate content in a proper way, but it might be very, very difficult. So we cannot fight fire with fire. So if somebody, some foreign governments sending disinformation, misinformation, or fake news, we cannot do the same thing. So we have to be careful. If our governments do the same thing, so people in Japan, people in the United States don't believe our governments, it's quite difficult situation. So I have no clear solution yet, but we have to be careful. So we have to be open to the discussion. So Prime Minister Kishida is always saying that he has capabilities to listen to others. And Japan will host the G7 summit next year in Hiroshima. So peace and security might be the top agenda, but we have to stick to democracy or open society. These kind of things we should discuss in the Hiroshima summit. Maybe I stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. And I'm glad your connection seemed to have resolved toward the end, but it's a really fascinating, and I think people will agree, a very, very timely question about sort of governance of our knowledge dissemination systems. We have a few questions that have come into the Q&A, so I'm gonna turn to those first, and then I might add some more of my own, kind of depending on where the discussion goes. And actually, I'm gonna bundle two of the ones that came in because both of them addressed something that I think has not even been mentioned, interestingly, in the through the initial remarks by our panelists, and that is the question of China. So we have two questions. One from Joseph Izumi from the US Asia Institute, who asked, how does the PRC come into the picture as regards to governance in the global commons, particularly in outer space? And then another question about China from Kensuke Abe, and this is particularly for John. Could you elaborate on the negotiation of the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea between the PRC and the Southeast Asian countries, and what would be its implications for maritime governance of the US and Japan if it is agreed? But I really want to make sure we open really the first question to everyone, because it does seem, we're in this era where we're talking about decoupling and the possibility of competing blocks sort of in global economic governance, but it would seem that that would extend to thinking about governance of the global commons that we're talking about today. So I'd be very interested in hearing all of your thoughts on what role China might play, and certainly what it's playing in challenging governance in those domains. But also I would add, is there a possibility for cooperation with China in any of these domains? And if you could talk about those as well. So I think this is going to occupy a good chunk of time in our discussion. Whoever wants to jump in first, I think we've got a lot to talk about.
So Tobias, I'll go first if you allow me to do one thing. And the thing I'd like to do is talk about China generally, and not talk about the South China Sea. I'm happy to talk about the South China Sea, but I think we have a lot in that question already. And so maybe we can put the South China Sea on the side, and your prerogative, depending where the conversation goes. I'm happy to go back to it.
Okay, great. Yeah,
I just think,
why don't we say general?
yeah. So generally speaking, how China fits into the maritime domain governance, as I sort of framed it earlier, is, it is a party to all of the major conventions. And those conventions, as I said, including UNCLOS II, the UN Law of the Sea Convention that was completed in 1982, China was very much a part of them. And for the most part, China is a positive contributor. I know that's an inconvenient truth to people, to the China hawks, but globally, it's a big trading country. Globally, it's interested in good governance at sea as well. I'm not saying it has a perfect record, but few actors do. But it is seeking cooperation. It took an active role in suppressing piracy around the Horn of Africa. It has an improving record for safety and well-being of its mariners. It's not at the same level as the US and Japan, but it's ahead of much of the world. And so on the global sort of regulation of trade and making sure that the maritime space is safe and secure for all users, there's a lot of room for cooperation. Now, whether or not the rest of the greater relationship allows that cooperation is a very separate issue. But on the other hand, China has a reputation, well-deserved, as being a bad actor in the space. And it's primarily a bad actor in the space because it no longer believes that the rules should be applied in its own backyard. And part of this has to do with border disputes, where they simply say the rules that are in place, give me jurisdiction here, when the international community generally does not agree with that, some issues more specifically than others. But in other cases, they're reinterpreting and arguing that the rules which were established by compromise should no longer apply to them, or should be reinterpreted. So really, the battle of maritime governance is China seeking to change the status quo in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. And I think the answer there is for the US and Japan to cooperate more closely to make sure there's no seams for China to exploit, but also to build up the capacity of the other claimant states so that they have the diplomatic and strategic backing that they need to push back, and they can also close the gaps. So, and that's the final point I'll make, is that maritime governance is about regulating states, but it's also about preventing those non-state actors from causing trouble. And so that really matters for two reasons. A lot of the Southeast Asian states have issues, a lack of capacity to deal with the non-state actors. And if they get the capacity to build against the non-state actors, that helps them hold the line against China in two ways. First, they can reallocate capacity. If they're not fighting as many pirates or terrorists, they can reallocate capacity to the conventional military contest. And second, it's that non-state actor space which is being exploited by China heavily by the weaponization of criminals and the weaponization, such as illegal fishers, and the weaponization of legitimate actors, such as shipping companies and fishers, and turning them into maritime militias. So the capacity that you use to draw the line and provide good governance allows you to enforce the rules universally. So that's where I think we should focus energy. Thanks.
So maybe we'll just go in order. So let me say, so Motohiro, I hope that's okay. I will go ahead of you too. Thank you so much. So with respect to the space domain, I would say the following. Technology is at the heart of the space domain, and technology is at the heart of the national economic and national security of the United States and Japan. So in some senses, when we're talking about collaboration over technology and having competitive edges in technology, that space is going to remain extremely contested between the US and China, and likely also with Japan and China. But overall, if we sort of step back, and also in the United States, we have, Tobias, I think you already mentioned this, but we've already begun to see sort of a decoupling from China on the technologies and the supply chains. We also have a Wolf Amendment in place, which prohibits sort of cooperation with China in the space domain. But what does all this mean? What is happening in the sort of the international space order? at least from my perspective, is that we're seeing really a bipolarity of space alliances. On the one side, we have the United States sort of leading with Japan, NATO, as well as members of the Quad. And on the other side, we have China, which has an international lunar space pact with Russia. It has its BRI, which extends from the ground to the space corridor. And it is also forging other relationships that are important in attracting allies or coalitions with capabilities. So I think from the perspective of what the US and what Japan can actually do is think very hard about what makes their alliance or their work with respect to space, and particularly with the responsible development of space, attractive to a bigger, more inclusive set of countries by thinking carefully about what those countries actually need or benefit from in a space. So in the long run, I think, I'm not so worried that we see this sort of bipolar alliance architecture emerging. What I want to try and understand is whether it can help to sort of advance some countries' interest in peaceful manners. And it's a competition. And if it's a competition for increasing and bringing more people on board, then, the side that is more attractive, more responsible, more technologically advanced, can in fact bring more people on, more coalitions on board. So I think that that's really where we are. I also want to echo something that John is saying about good behavior and bad behavior with respect specifically to the space domain. I think it is certainly true that with its 2007 ASAT test, China did sort of break the norm of not testing anti-satellite weaponry, but many other countries have also followed suit, right? So India followed suit, the US followed suit, then Russia just followed suit. So I think if you kind of set the norms for that kind of permissible activity in space, this is a very hazardous domain where the slightest bit of debris floating around can really shut down human activities in space. So I think we need to think very carefully about what kinds of responsible behaviors in space we can get, not just with respect to space resources, but also with respect to military space activities. So I think that that's where we are. Again, like the governance of space resources in general, this is a work in progress, but it's happening and solidifying fairly rapidly, given the changes that the Biden administration has put into place. So I will stop there.
So I want to talk about technology too. So Saadia mentioned the importance of technology, but in terms of governance of cyberspace, there are at least 3 actors in each country. So one is technology people, geeks. So these people are maintaining the cyberspace in each country. So they are connecting networks to other networks. But so the second actor is suits, like me. So we are wearing a tie and wearing a jacket. So people in Kasumigaseki or Washington, D.C. are discussing the policy of the telecommunication networks. But the third actors are joining in each country these days. So it's uniforms, so military people. So US Cyber Command, a Japanese Self-Defense Force Cyber Defense Unit, and maybe Israel, UK, and China, Russia, all have cyber units these days. So they are trying to jump into cyberspace. But so each country, these people are discussing the cyberspace governance, but they never agree on consensus. So they have pursuing their own national interests and their own organizational interests. Of course, technology people are connected globally, so they are trying to maintain good governance of cyberspace, but it's divided these days in the democratic country and the other countries. So in addition to those 3 actors of governance, we have information consumers, but they are not pure consumers. They are becoming producers too. So they are called prosumers, producing and consuming. So they are creating their information content by themselves. And those kind of information are circulated in many ways. So Kelly asked a question about social media. Yes, it's so the cyber cascade is examined in many countries. So we are not seeing a big river or big ocean. So we are just looking at a small cascade in each country, each sector, each tribes. So it's quite difficult to understand what others are thinking. So that's why we cannot make a consensus. So our cyberspace is not a big unified space. It's a divided spaces actually. So we are just connecting our computers, devices, and networks, but they don't understand each other. That is a truth, I think. So we are quite a difficult situation to govern cyberspace these days. Thank you.
And just to jump in with some overarching or maybe somewhat integrating thoughts from looking at all three of the domains, it's definitely true that the rise of China is really driving a lot of these dynamics in multiple ways, politically, economically, in terms of security. It's also intertwined with environment and technology concerns, for example. So I think that it is striking how that really permeates the discussion across maritime space and cyberspace. As far as China's involvement, I think it's also important to note, as others have alluded to, that China certainly complies with and very strongly supports existing global governance in many cases where that has been really essential to its economic growth and to some of its security interests, for example. It's also been extremely active in promoting different kinds of governance or trying to shape principles and norms and rules, particularly in cyberspace, where those things are still more in formation. But it's also true that China does not comply, or it subverts or selectively complies with governance in other cases, which is, as also was mentioned by Saadia and others, a dangerous type of behavior because it encourages, deviations from rules that are there supposedly for the good of all to access spaces, et cetera, safely. And, if that becomes the norm of selective compliance, then that is a weakness to governance. Now, it's also true that many countries selectively comply with governance, so this is not, in fact, new, but on the scale at which China is engaging in governance and also engaging in different kinds of behaviors and dynamics in these domains, it is a striking trend that we see across all three.
I'd like to follow, Tobias, may I just make a comment to what Chris said? I think that this was a very important question, and this discussion just shows that it is important to keep China in mind as you're devising whatever governance mechanisms that you are devising. I think that goes across the domains. But Motohiro, after I listened to you, I think that maybe it's very difficult to even talk about cyber governance, and that in some senses it's a very different domain than either the maritime domain or the space domain. And in that kind of scenario, because it's not visible what you are doing or what you are capable of doing, it makes it harder to talk about governance. So I think that perhaps it would be helpful, as Kristi, as you go on, to pull out some of the conditions and was sort of making it easier to talk about governance, because my takeaway lesson from listening to Motohiro and John is that maybe there's a huge difference in what can be governed and not governed, depending on what we are looking at. And then one other thing that I want to put on the table is this discussion about non-state actors. And in the space domain, at least, there's a lot of talk about commercial actors, and you probably hear about them in the newspapers the whole time. They're not, they're pretty much in the open. So SpaceX, and particularly led by companies in the US. But what I would say is that all these companies, even in Western countries, are very much reliant on government contracts to sort of be profitable or remain profitable in the short to medium term. So I think that states can't be taken out of the equation, no matter how big the mantra is about non-state actors kind of being part of the space, particularly in these kinds of strategic domains. Thank you, Tobias, for giving me the floor.
No, that's fine, and thank you for taking the next question from our Q&A about state and private actors. We've got a few questions that are sort of kind of broad questions about governance of the commons and kind of sweeping themes. And so again, maybe good for putting to all of our panelists. From Kelly Primrose at the Mansfield Foundation, she asked about how attitudes towards common goods or public goods have changed over time. Says there's a prevailing narrative in the United States, at least, that social media and all the rest has made us all more tribal and selfish. But has this proven to be true in terms of the actual steps countries are taking in the commons today versus yesterday?
My screen is on, yes, actively.
So I don't know if we want before, and we've got a couple others, but maybe we can start with that. That is there. Have we seen a new attitude towards global attitudes towards this idea of public goods and governance of the commons? Or is the premise of the question correct? Even in the United States, I guess there are some who might question the value of public goods, but on the whole, has there been a change that you've all noted?
Gosh.
I don't have a good answer to the question, but so common goods, cyberspace is really common goods. That's a question, actually. So it is owned by many people, so many companies, so many network operators. So in the internet is networks of networks. So each computers, each devices, each servers, each devices are owned by someone else. So we are just connecting. So nobody has the rights to own the whole cyberspace, whole internet. And so the internet is somehow smaller, and cyberspace is becoming bigger and bigger these days, because some computer devices, so information technology devices, are not connected to the internet, but those devices are supporting our social lives. So for example, traffic signal is operated by computer devices these days, but that's not connected to the internet. So we are dependent on devices, but how we can manage these whole devices as one common thing, it's quite difficult. So it's a misunderstanding that so the internet is floating somewhere in the sky. So people talking about cloud services, but it's not really cloud. It's just devices of servers or data centers. Mm-hmm. So we have to stick to the devices in each country, how and who are manipulating, operating, maintaining those devices. It's quite difficult to manage it by a foreign country. So UNGGE, United Nations, a group of governmental experts are talking about how we can maintain cyberspace. But so there are, I think, 6 or 7 rounds of discussions at the United Nations, but it's quite difficult to make a consensus how we can manage it. So sorry, I don't have a good answer, but so it's quite difficult.
Anyone else want to take a stab at that question?
Sure, I will. So in the maritime space, I want to talk about 2 trajectories that I think get towards the answer, although I don't have a great answer. As far as overall, I would argue that contribution to the maritime space as a global commons is overall improving, with 2 major trajectories going on. So one is the state cooperation, and this is a place where we have a mixed record, and we're probably on a downslope. So I just said we're improving. I think overall we're improving because that's the net of the 2 different trajectories. As far as state cooperation, in the mid-Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union both had fairly similar worldviews on how the maritime space should be governed. And this is what allowed in the 1980s completion of the UNCLOS, the so-called Constitution of the Seas, and then it allowed the sort of global governance framework that we have today to really solidify. And then in the post-Cold War, in the maritime space, we had a very unipolar moment where the United States was left in the sole leadership. It kept those same traditions alive. It kept those same norms alive. And the conversation became much more about stamping out the non-state actor threats. And then in the last 10 years or so, you see a resurgent China and a growing a resurgent Russia and a growing Chinese power, both which are seeming to disrupt things. So as those states seek to reorganize things, we're now in the last decade losing the idea that the seas are a common space that all states should support, but it's still pretty high, and it's still higher than it would have been 60, 70 years ago. In the non-state actor threat, it's a very different trajectory. Everyone continues to push back against non-state actors, and state capacity is in many ways at an all-time high. So piracy, smuggling, terrorism are all problems, but they're all dropping. Now, what this is allowing is increased awareness of other issues. So, for example, there's been a growing consciousness in the last 5 years or so about slavery at sea, and especially on fishing boats. So this is a terrible thing. And if you read articles, you would think it was increasing. You would see there's more cases of it, there's more prosecution of it. But to some extent, I mean, I don't think anyone believes that this wasn't happening before. We were worried about other issues and the tackling of IU fishing, the tackling of actors that provide subpar labor conditions for their seafarers, and that improvement of governance allows us to uncover this problem. And globally, it's generally being addressed, although not so well. I do think that there's a possibility that in this area we could corners could be turned. And I think a lot of that has to do with, I mentioned earlier, climate change, but also cyber. As the maritime domain becomes increasingly reliant on the cyber domain, the problems and the governance challenges that have been discussed in this meeting are increasingly going to seep into the maritime domain. So as everything becomes more connected, we need to be on guard for negative trends.
Just one final note from me on this question. I think it's when you look over across the domains, I don't think you necessarily see trends in attitudes towards whether things should be commons or not changing overall, but you always see that those attitudes are intrinsically linked to the interests or attitudes of those actors about other things. So, in the maritime governance situation, it's always very different whether you're talking about landlocked states versus coastal states. Some states have made a big push historically for the 4 commons recognized under international law to be thought of as the common heritage of humanity, and a lot of non-state actors, NGOs, et cetera, have a big investment in maintaining access of those and not having them be enclosed in certain ways. So I think it's difficult to say overall, but I think it's always been a challenging notion that things should be commons. There's always a desire to enclose them by some actors who would receive benefits from doing so. So you see this interplay, I think, across all of the domains, and really the trick to it and finding compromises is engaging with those multiple stakeholders and finding those intersections and those specificities even within domains, within specific issues about what exactly you're trying to govern.
Mm-hmm. May I just add one thing to this conversation? Again, Kelly, great question. I don't have an answer for you, but you're very knowledgeable about the space domain. So what I will say will not come as a surprise to you, but one of the phenomena that we have seen over the past few years is this rise of mega constellations that are really designed to connect the internet. And Motohiro, I know you are kind of, so I mean, this is extremely important. It just sort of came up in the Ukraine war. So the fact of these commercial actors, the rise of these mega constellations is perhaps the first time in my judgment that perhaps the public has become aware that there is something out there that is observing you, and that it can be important for wartime and it can also be important for peacetime. And that the information that we get connects to what Motohiro was saying at the beginning. It is data, and how people receive the information that we get really will affect the prospects for peace building and democracies going forward. So I think that that's an important thing to keep an eye on as we move forward in these domains. I think satellites are also a good way of connecting all the domains because they cut across, all the domains in the physical sense that Motohiro was talking about. And the data are everything. So how we deal with that and how we think about governing that is also an extremely important rising issue. Thank you.
So we are creeping up to the end of the hour. I have two more questions, but I want to take Andrew Orlow's question because I think it actually brings us back to this question of how the U.S. and Japan can work together. And so Andrew asks, for all the panelists, what would you say about concerns from other countries that the U.S. and Japan could constitute a sort of G2 to the exclusion of other stakeholders? And I would add to that, to what extent, do we have to think about, the U.S. and Japan cooperating, and what that could mean for north-south issues and equity and distributive justice and sort of access to the commons, from emerging countries, these developed countries, countries that maybe have not historically been in a position to write the rules, and what can the U.S. and Japan do about that? So Andrew, I'm sorry to piggyback on your question, but I think it raises some really important issues that we're not going to be able to cover fully in the 3 minutes we have left. But if anyone wants to jump in with sort of some quick thoughts, I think that would be a great way to finish.
I'll start. Just in terms of a G2, I mean, from what I think we've discussed in this project, our running theme from many seems to be that, two countries alone, even if they're the US and Japan and very influential, cannot solve governance problems on their own, and they need partners. And so I think that who those partners are varies with the specifics of the issue that you're talking about to a large extent at times. Sometimes they're like-minded countries in Europe, sometimes there are other countries in the Indo-Pacific region. But I think that clearly these governance structures don't have the weight of legitimacy, and they don't inspire compliance unless they have broad-based buy-in from other actors, and that's something that has to be done. In some sense, it doesn't really make sense to talk about global governance with just two countries. But we are in a time when the global system is quite fragmented and everyone is turning towards bilateral and minilateral mechanisms for dialogue, et cetera. So in some ways, this is a building block approach to trying to tackle some of these goals. But in my opinion, this is even the US and Japan do not see eye to eye on all of these issues, for example, and it's more of a exercise in trying to build shared understandings and cultivate partnerships.
Andrew, I think also a great question. I'll just jump in and say very quickly that, yes, it is true that everybody wants to be a space power, but not all space powers are have equal capabilities. And the US and Japan, of course, are extremely capable space powers, and that puts them in a special category of how they want to think about building responsible behavior in space. Because just as Kristi is saying, what they're doing together is a building block for sort of making a bigger and more inclusive coalition, because that's the only way to sustain and legitimize what they're doing in and through space going forward. So I think that that's very important to remember about what they're attempting to do together.
Yeah, and I think in the maritime space, my first word would be, Andrew's question includes the word exclusionary, and the United States and Japan's coordination should not be exclusionary. I argue that these are the two leading maritime powers, and so what they should do is they should coordinate to be more effective and more efficient in supporting the global system, which includes the G20, which you mentioned, but also includes the global governance structures.
So I just have a quick word. So G2, I hope it works, but I think US, Japan, not enough, I think. So Europe is becoming a big actor in cyberspace these days. And so China and India had too big to neglect. And so Saadia talked about commercial actors. Of course, in cyberspace, they are very powerful. And I want to quote very old words by David Clark in 1992. He said that he's a professor at MIT. We reject kings, presidents, and voting. We believe in rough consensus and running code. That's geek's idea. So, but running code, that's an important term. So how we can make make the internet running? So that's an important aspect for everybody. So how we can G2, other governments, G7, G20, so we can cooperate, make the things better in cyberspace. That's the important thing. So we cannot make a treaty, so formal treaty, but maybe we can make a running code. That's important in governance of cyberspace. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of our panelists, I think, for a really illuminating discussion. Thank you to our guests for some really great questions that I think brought out really the major themes. I just would like to share as we wrap up that you can look for this edited volume from GMF later this month. And also video of this discussion should be available on YouTube soon. I'm not going to say exactly when, but soon. So again, thank you to the U.S.-Japan Foundation for supporting this work. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you everyone for attending, and good evening to everyone.